And so looking at some general approaches, some home remedies, and this will be probably a multi-part conversation. And many of the suggestions are coming from the work of someone who spent a lot of time, and I'll share with this down the road a little bit to some of the specific cases where they worked in the natural world in helping people with situations around cancer. Jethro Kloss. But these suggestions, many of them are coming from him. Some of them are things that I've learned along the way too. But we'll just kind of dive into this as we get started. So one of the things that we want to be sure to remember is that while cancer is a dread disease, it's a diagnosis and not a death decree. Many people have recovered from cancer and gone on to lead normal, healthy lives for many years following that. But essentially, cancer is what occurs when your cells in a particular place in your body lose their ability to die when they're supposed to. So they have something called programmed cell death. It's called apoptosis in the scientific world. And all cells normally have a lifespan. For example, blood cells have a 30-day lifespan. Bone takes 10 years to turn around and have a whole new set of bone. And neurons, for example, have your entire life. The neurons you're born with, the neurons that will stay with you throughout your life. That's why it's so important to protect brain tissue. There is some neurogenesis that takes place, new nerve growth. If you have an injury, it can happen. It can grow back to some extent, but there's some very specific things that can aid neuroregeneration. Brain neuronal tissue is much more sensitive to trauma, as well as chemical disruption of its function, i.e. from alcohol and other sources as well, pressure. So even though neurons have a lifelong ability to stay with you, they can be destroyed as well. So the lifespan of a cancer cell is essentially indefinite. When I taught human anatomy and physiology, we shared a video about the immortal life of Henrietta Lack, which was about a cell line of cancer cells that is still going today, that was harvested back in the 60s and has been continued to replicate itself continuously since that time. So it's a very kind of a long cell line. So they just don't have, they've lost that ability to shut themselves off. So that's a problem, especially when it creates a tumor mass that can create pressure or take up space, change endocrine function of organs, and multitude other types of manifestations. There's all different types of cancers. So many of the notes that I'm going to share with you come from a book called Back to Eden by Jethro Kloss. Many of the cancers that are encountered have lifestyle-based or chemical triggers. At some point in a person's life, they were exposed to something or carried out an activity that maybe made them more susceptible to a genetic alteration of the way the cell's life cycle is altered, whether that be the blood or skin or other tissue. So there is a genetic basis in that regard. In fact, they've isolated various genes that make a person more or less susceptible to various types of cancer. They found that for breast cancer, for example. But those genes are turned on and off by environmental factors most often. So they can be turned on by a chemical challenge, or they can be turned on and off by dietary support of your body. So for example, insulin production is turned on by the presence of sugar. If you have low sugar presence, your pancreas isn't going to be producing those cells. So the genes can be turned on and off and produce proteins and do things based on the challenges that we provide them throughout our day and our life, including stress. So stress levels can also have a negative impact on the cell cycle and on immunity and things like that. So it's important to manage stress and lower stresses as much as possible that are negative stresses. There is something called eustress, which is like exercise and things like that that are beneficial, because without stress in our lives, we don't maintain tone and optimal body function. For example, bone density is maintained by stress. So weight-bearing activities like standing or walking, heel strike activities are what make our bones strong and aid in calcium deposition. So there are stresses that are important in our life, as well as negative stresses. So more than half of cancers are preventable and due to unhealthy living or unhealthy eating habits. And most of that is based on the SAD diet, which is a great acronym, which stands for the Standard American Diet. And I know that our audience here is very familiar with the difference between the Standard American Diet and a healthful diet, but it's important to just kind of remember what those things are, in addition to just thinking we know, because sometimes we think things are healthier than they actually are. So the SAD diet, hallmarks of the SAD diet, Standard American Diet, are that they're high in fat. So typically those are going to be, in the Standard American Diet, those are going to be animal fats, but include other types of fats like trans fats, and those are hydrogenated oils, as well as saturated fats like animal fats and other palm fats like coconut and palm oils, lots of those, and damaged fats. So they're going to have those types of fats in a high quantity. The SAD diet also has a high processed sugar content, particularly cane sugar is a feeder of cancer and lowers immune system. And actually, excessive consumption of sugar decreases the pain threshold. So people who consume more sugar have less pain tolerance. So if you want to have a higher pain threshold, cutting the sugar out, that's one way that you can help with that. Also, the Standard American diet is low on the consumption of vegetables. We need at least 5 to 9 servings a day of vegetables. Also, refined foods. So refined foods is anything that's been processed and packaged. Essentially what happens is the nutrient values are stripped away from the food through polishing or milling into flours sometimes. White flour has much of its nutritive value pulled away, and then it's reconstituted into edible food-like substances as opposed to actual food. That's why there's a push right now for the whole foods plant-based diet, which is really the anchor point for a healthy lifestyle. Processed meats and just meat in general of all types is also part of the Standard American Diet, which is very deleterious in all aspects of good health. And also the lack of water consumption. So low hydration is critical, dehydration, and then other liquid substances, juices, alcohol, soda, that type of thing is all negative for good health. Some sad lifestyle factors that can contribute to cancer. We already mentioned stress, negative stress, excessive stress. We can also have chemical exposures that can happen over the course of a lifetime that can manifest themselves at a time much removed from the initial point of challenge, but that can be mitigated even at a later date and time to a significant degree by becoming aware of that and doing not only dietary intervention, but also there can be other therapeutic modalities that can have benefit to that. Genetically modified exposures, so plant and animal tissue that has been tinkered with from the genomic level, so changing the molecular structure can change the protein makeup of that particular plant or animal without knowing the long-term consequences associated with that. They may look the same, they may act the same, but the proteins that are made by that plant or animal are not going to be the same as what God created. And so that's going to have some kind of an impact somewhere along the line. various occupational hazards from an airborne standpoint, as well as a chemical or radiation standpoint. Low exercise. So exercise is also a key factor. Excess sun exposure can also have implications on skin structure for skin cancers. Smoking, the time that the book Back to Eden was written, smoking was a major contributor to lung cancers, and lung cancers in men and women was a leading type of cancer at that time. Smoking in our country has decreased significantly, although it's still present. And other types of cancers have moved up into a higher level that are more dietary based now than smoking based. But there are other types of inhalations that people do that can have triggering effects. We don't know the long-term effects of vaping and other types of inhalation types of activities that people participate in. So this is a good place to talk about the New START acronym. Nutrition, exercise, adequate hydration and water, getting proper sunlight. You don't want to be burned, but you do need sunlight because that's an important part of vitamin D production in our bodies. So we need to just be very cognizant of the sunlight that we are exposed to, that it doesn't burn. I think for many years we have been afraid of the sun, the sunscreens and complete coverage, and so vitamin D deficiency has become prominent, even though we do live in a higher latitude portion of the United States where sun exposure is minimal. We minimize our ability to produce our own vitamin D at a higher level because we have tended to cover more often than maybe we should. So we do need sun. We just need to be judicious about it. And then temperance in all things. Don't overdo things or underdo things. Fresh air, making sure that we have fresh, clean air to breathe, and adequate rest. Tiredness can contribute significantly to illness and disease resistibility. And then finally, trust in God. And that should probably be at the very beginning. We could probably call it Trat Swen, and start with trust in God, because that's a very key component to everything that we do and the success in our lives. So diets that benefit cancer also benefit diabetes, weight loss, heart disease. They have a common factor, and they're a whole foods, plant-based vegan diet is the diet that is found to have been the most beneficial for all essentially chronic and acute types of diseases that occur in mankind today. They're actually considered modernization disease syndrome is one way that it's referred to, essentially seen in industrialized nations as opposed to nations and countries and tribes, for example, like New Guinea, for example, or areas in Africa where they're eating a native diet. They're getting outside and exercising a lot. They're not sedentary. They're not eating refined foods. As soon as we see those refined foods and sedentary activities and things coming into the situation, for example, in the Pacific Islands, we start to see the Western diseases follow right behind them. So all disease violates natural law at some level, or is an outgrowth of having natural law violated at some level. And it's our job to figure out what that is, and then to change those violations of natural law to bring our bodies back into health and well-being. So some various sources of cancer initiation. We can have chronic autointoxication. We can have constipation. So constipation basically is an inactivity of the elimination organs, a stopping of the flow of waste material out of the body, and so it harbors toxins close to the bowel for long periods of time or longer periods of time. Some people don't have a bowel movement for a week at a time or more, as opposed to once or twice a day. That's very healthy in a high fiber diet, and a high fiber diet is a very important part of a smoothly operating gastrointestinal tract. But you want to have active elimination organs. So that's your skin, your bowels, your kidneys, your liver, your lungs. Those are all need to be functioning at an optimal level so that we can have optimal elimination of toxins from our body. Where those organs are not functioning at their optimum, they can end up having poisons and toxins accumulate in those organs. And it turns out that in many cases, cancers will arise in those organ systems that have been weakened in some fashion, either by an injury or a bruise or some kind of a fall or some other, maybe a chemical challenge of some way. The cancers will tend to become more prolific or show up in those weakened organs. So some sources of personal poisoning, the improper use of foods. So one thing that we're learning about now is that, eating legumes and seeds and beans and things like that, in order to eat those effectively, to get the most nourishment out of them, you need to soak them and wash off the water to get away the anti-nutrients that are part of those seeds. So they have anti-nutrients that protect those seeds pre-germination. Once they imbibe water, get water around them, and are soaked, then they are ready for planting and germination. So the best time to eat them is after they've been soaked and rinsed, and actually even post-sprouted. Please remember that that's an important part of eating those things. Liquor and actually alcohol of all kinds are a source of personal poisoning. And if you think about that too, we may be consuming alcohol and not even know it. So there are certain combinations of foods that produce alcohol as a byproduct of that. So for example, milk and sugar together, a byproduct of that is alcohol. There's something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And essentially it is excess sugar consumption that the liver has to deal with, particularly high fructose corn syrup. But people who have never consumed a drop of alcohol in their life can have fatty liver disease just like an alcoholic, essentially because the food they've consumed over a protracted period of time has produced alcohol in their system, which then their body has to eliminate using alcohol dehydrogenase and other elimination mechanisms of the body, and it's taxing on the body. Cane sugar products in particular, there are other types of sugar that are better sweeteners that are better to use than cane sugar. Cane sugar in particular is targeted, and other refined sugars. Tea, tobacco, white flour, and rice, which is essentially a denatured type of food because the nutrients have been stripped away. Coffee, soft drinks, all meats, especially pork, which we know is something that's not something that should be consumed. So cancer would be rare if devitalized foods and meats were not eaten and all unhealthy living habits were eliminated. And sometimes we don't even know we may be participating in an unhealthy living habit or lifestyle until we're challenged with a disease state. And then we need to go and look and really assess our situation and make changes as best we can to help reverse those types of situations. Devitalized food is essentially food that is missing its mineral and nutrient contents through refining. And it's refined and done that way for the purpose of extending shelf life, not for increasing the nutritive value of the food itself. So vital food, as opposed to devital food, is full of enzymes, has lots of phytofactors, has its vitamin and mineral contents intact. They're life-giving, and they keep the blood pure, which is very important, key to keeping your body cancer-free and keeping it at bay. So those life-giving factors are most often found. Vital means vita means life. So living foods are important. So some foods need to have some cooking or processing associated with them, but the more whole food and closer to the garden you can get, the more raw it is. A completely raw diet can be a challenge, but the more living enzymes, because heat destroys enzymes when you cook, the more living the food is and the more beneficial those enzymes and minerals and vitamins will be. Minerals are not going to be destroyed by heat, but vitamins, phytofactors, enzymes, those types of things will be destroyed by heat and cooking. So a whole food, a plant-based vegan diet has been demonstrated over and over and over again to be highly protective on all fronts of health. So 7 signs of potential cancer: change in bowel or bladder habits, a sore that doesn't heal, unusual bleeding or discharge from any body exit point, so ear, nose, throat, etc., a thickening or lump in any soft tissue, indigestion or difficulty swallowing that hasn't been previously experienced, and obvious changes for skin cancer in a wart or a mole. So is it asymmetrical? Are the borders irregular? Is there a color variation within the given mole? Are there diameter changes that occur over time? And are there basically changing features as you watch it from month to month or day to day? So those could be, should be a warning sign to have something checked out. And then a nagging cough or hoarseness present. So essentially, the 7 signs of potential cancer basically is listen to your body, be aware of changes in your condition from day to day, and just check in on those types of things, and be ready to have a screening done if necessary. So some natural treatment options. A key component is that any form of cancer should be taken seriously. If not eradicated in some way, it can metastasize or spread and become more of a problem. So the eradication or elimination or reversal of the disease process can take several different forms. The 3 that are most common are surgical removal, chemotherapy treatment, radiation therapy, and they have their place and their scope. But nutritional therapy is one that is not looked upon by the establishment in a way that is as helpful as it could be, because they aren't trained in that modality of treatment. So there are people who are trained in that modality of treatment, and it can be very helpful, because not only is it longer lasting, but it has less side effects associated with it. It should be a point of daily activity, so both preventative and therapeutic. So thinking about just living that lifestyle all the time, is it going to be preventative? It can be therapeutic if one contracts a particular disease, including cancer. One thing, the wild card in the whole situation is you. Compliance is really, patient compliance is the huge factor. If you cut it out, I mean, you do it and you're done, it's out. But if you haven't changed lifestyle habits along the way, it can recur more easily. Chemotherapy and radiation, there's just a lot of side effects associated with that. You're going through a program that's very regimented. Patient compliance is mandated. But when you're doing a nutritional thing, nutritional therapy and diet, it's easy to just cheat and do something different and fall off, get derailed, go on vacation, you lose your groove. But that's really important for maintaining the integrity of a therapeutic approach that's nutritional based. So it's only helpful though, even though it's slower acting, it can reverse, and the side effects, there's no negative side effects associated with nutritional therapy. One thing that needs to be trained is your appetite. The appetite is one that has to be cultivated for long-term compliance and change in lifestyle. And it's not necessarily immediately felt. A correction, of course, can move the body to healing, particularly in an appetite fashion. And the body, with God's help, is able to completely correct itself. So here's a quote from Testimonies, Volume 2, pages 69 and 70, which bears on this very, very acutely. And it says, nature bears, should be B-A-R-E-S. Well, no, it's correct. Bears. Nature bears abuse as long as she can without resisting. Then she arouses and makes a mighty effort to rid herself of the encumbrances and evil treatment she has suffered. So this is talking about the human body. Then come headaches, chills, fevers, nervousness, paralysis, and other evils too numerous to mention. A wrong course of eating or drinking destroys health, and with it, the sweetness of life. Oh, how many times have you purchased what you called a good meal at the expense of a fevered system, a loss of appetite, and a loss of sleep? Inability to enjoy food, a sleepless night, hours of suffering, all for a meal in which taste is gratified. Thousands have indulged their perverted appetites, have eaten a good meal as they have called it, and as the result have brought on a fever or some other acute disease and certain death. That was enjoyment purchased at immense cost. Yet many have done this, and these self-murderers have been eulogized by their friends in the minister and carried directly to heaven at their death. What a thought! Gluttons in heaven? No, no, such will never enter the pearly gates of the golden city of God. Such will never be exalted to the right hand of Jesus, the precious Savior, the suffering man of Calvary, whose life was one of constant self-denial and sacrifice. There is a place appointed for such among the unworthy, who can have no part in the better life, the immortal inheritance. God requires all men to render their bodies to him a living sacrifice, not a dead or dying sacrifice. God calls for a living sacrifice. The body, he tells us, is the temple of the Holy Ghost, the habitation of his Spirit, and he requires all who bear his image to take care of their bodies for the purpose of his service and his glory. Ye are not your own. Ye are bought with a price. There's some significant heavy statements in that quote from Mrs. White, Second Testimonies, pages 69 and 70, but it bears directly on the topic and all topics of wellness and disease. So step one is to cleanse the bloodstream. And essentially you want to relieve any constipation, make sure all the organs of elimination are fully functional. So skin, liver, bowels, lungs, and kidneys. And I've learned a little bit about this from a friend of mine, Mercy Ballard, from Years Restored Lifestyle and Learning Center. And there's a link there to her facility down in Northern California. But starting out with a cleansing diet and a cleansing activity so that the organs of elimination are fully functional. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that your bowels are completely, clear and able to move things through efficiently. So an excellent recipe for an herbal laxative. It's very non-poisonous, very soothing, anti-gas forming, is to use some herbs here. So combine in equal parts, mixing thoroughly buckthorn bark, it should be thorn bark, rhubarb root, cascara bark, calamus root, and fennel seed. And the dosage for that is a 1/4 teaspoon per 1/4 glass of water, and follow that with a glass of hot water. So you drink your herb mix, and then follow it with hot water after you've consumed that. So use that after meals, or about a 1/2 teaspoon upon going to bed, and adjust as needed for the various levels of elimination that are desired. And these herbs, some of the herbs can be found. There is a new Seventh-day Adventist naturopath physician who has the American Herb Shop, AmericanHerbShop.com. Just learned about it this last weekend through a friend, through a presentation by Mercy Ballard and Joyce Cho. But AmericanHerbShop.com be a good resource for herbs